Overture by Marcel Proust, Remembrance of Things Past. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Sometimes, when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, "I'm going to sleep." And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would try to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had been thinking all the time, while I was asleep, of what I had just been reading, but my thoughts had run into a channel of their own, until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book, a church, a quartet, the rivalry between Swan and Charles Wilfrid V. This impression would persist for some moments after I was awake. It did not disturb my mind, but it lay like scales upon my eyes and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a former existence must be to a reincarnate spirit. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to choose whether I would form part of it or no. And at the same time, my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for the eyes, and even more, perhaps, for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible without a cause, a matter dark indeed. I would ask myself what o'clock it could be. I could hear the whistling of trains, which, now nearer and now farther off, punctuating the distance like the note of a bird in a forest, shewed me in perspective the deserted countryside through which a traveller would be hurrying towards the nearest station, the path that he followed being fixed forever in his memory by the general excitement due to being in a strange place, to doing unusual things, to the last words of conversation, to farewells exchanged beneath an unfamiliar lamp which echoed still in his ears amid the silence of the night, and to the delightful prospect of being once again at home. I would lay my cheeks gently against the comfortable cheeks of my pillow, as plump and blooming as the cheeks of babyhood. Or I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight. The hour when an invalid, who has been obliged to start on a journey and to sleep in a strange hotel, awakens in a moment of illness and sees with glad relief a streak of daylight shewing under his bedroom door. Oh, joy of joys! It is morning. The servants will be about in a minute, he can ring, and someone will come to look after him. The thought of being made comfortable gives him strength to endure his pain. He is certain he heard footsteps. They come nearer and then die away. The ray of light beneath his door is extinguished. It is midnight. Someone has turned out the gas. The last servant has gone to bed, and he must lie all night in agony with no one to bring him any help. I would fall asleep, and often I would be awake again for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes, to settle the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savour, in an instantaneous flash of perception, the sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room, the whole surroundings of which I formed but an insignificant part, and whose unconsciousness I should very soon return to share. Or perhaps, while I was asleep, I had returned without the least effort to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, such as that old terror of my great-uncle's pulling my curls, which was effectually dispelled on the day, the dawn of a new era to me, on which they were finally cropped from my head. I had forgotten that event during my sleep. I remembered it again immediately I had succeeded in making myself wake up to escape my great-uncle's fingers. Still, as a measure of precaution, I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, too, just as Eve was created from a rib of Adam, so a woman would come into existence while I was sleeping, conceived from some strain in the position of my limbs. Formed by the appetite that I was on the point of gratifying, She it was, I imagined, who offered me that gratification. My body, conscious that its own warmth was permeating hers, would strive to become one with her, and I would awake. The rest of humanity seemed very remote in comparison with this woman whose company I had left but a moment ago. My cheek was still warm with her kiss, my body bent beneath the weight of hers. If, as would sometimes happen, she had the appearance of some woman whom I had known in waking hours, I would abandon myself altogether to the sole quest of her, like people who set out on a journey to see with their own eyes some city that they have always longed to visit, and imagine that they can taste in reality what has charmed their fancy. And then, gradually, the memory of her would dissolve and vanish, until I had forgotten the maiden of my dream. When a man is asleep, he has in a circle round him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly host. Instinctively, when he awakes, he looks to these, and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface and the amount of time that has elapsed during his slumbers. But this ordered procession is apt to grow confused and to break its ranks. Suppose that, towards morning, after a night of insomnia, sleep descends upon him while he is reading, in quite a different position from that in which he normally goes to sleep. He has only to lift his arm to arrest the sun and turn it back in its course, and, at the moment of waking, he will have no idea of the time, but will conclude that he has just gone to bed. Or suppose that he gets drowsy in some even more abnormal position, sitting in an armchair, say, after dinner. Then the world will fall topsy-turvy from its orbit, the magic chair will carry him at full speed through time and space, and when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier and in some far distant country. But for me, it was enough, if in my own bed, my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness. For then, I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep, and when I awoke at midnight, not knowing where I was, I could not be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute of human qualities than the cave dweller. But then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived, and might now very possibly be, would come like a rope let down from heaven to draw me up out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash, I would traverse and surmount centuries of civilization, and out of a half-visualized succession of oil lamps, followed by shirts with turned-down collars, would put together by degrees the component parts of my ego. Perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves, and not anything else, and by the immobility of our conceptions of them. For it always happened that when I awoke like this, and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was, everything would be moving round me through the darkness. Things, places, years. My body, still too heavy with sleep to move, would make an effort to construe the form which its tiredness took as an orientation of its various members, so as to induce from that where the wall lay and the furniture stood, to piece together and to give a name to the house in which it must be living. Its memory, the composite memory of its ribs, knees, and shoulder blades, offered it a whole series of rooms in which it had, at one time or another, slept, while the unseen walls kept changing, adapting themselves to the shape of each successive room that it remembered, whirling madly through the darkness. And even before my brain, lingering in consideration of when things had happened and of what they had looked like, had collected sufficient impressions to enable it to identify the room, it, my body, would recall from each room in succession what the bed was like, where the doors were, how daylight came in at the windows, whether there was a passage outside, what I had had in my mind when I went to sleep, and had found there when I awoke. The stiffened side underneath my body would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying, face to the wall, in a big bed with a canopy. And at once I would say to myself, why, I must have gone to sleep after all, and Mamma never came to say good night. For I was in the country with my grandfather, who died years ago, and my body, the side upon which I was lying, loyally preserving from the past an impression which my mind should never have forgotten, brought back before my eyes the glimmering flame of the nightlight in its bowl of Bohemian glass, shaped like an urn and hung by chains from the ceiling, and the chimney-piece of Sienna marble in my bedroom at Combre, in my great-aunt's house, in those far-distant days which, at the moment of waking, seemed present without being clearly penned, but would become plainer in a little while when I was properly awake. Then would come up the memory of a fresh position. The wall slid away in another direction. I was in my room in Madame de Saint-Loux's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept myself in the little nap which I always take when I come in from my walk with Madame de Saint-Loux before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Combre days, when coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the reflection of the sunset glowing in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different kind of existence at Tansonville now with Madame de Saint-Loux, and a different kind of pleasure that I now derive from taking walks only in the evenings, from visiting by moonlight the roads on which I used to play as a child in the sunshine, while the bedroom in which I shall presently fall asleep instead of dressing for dinner, from afar off I can see it as we return from our walk with its lamp shining through the window, a solitary beacon in the night. These shifting and confused gusts of memory never lasted for more than a few seconds. It often happened that, in my spell of uncertainty as to where I was, I did not distinguish the successive theories of which that uncertainty was composed any more than, when we watch a horse running, we isolate the successive positions of its body as they appear upon a bioscope. But I had seen first one and then another of the rooms in which I had slept during my life, and in the end I would revisit them all in the long course of my waking dream. Rooms in winter, where on going to bed I would at once bury my head in a nest, built up out of the most diverse materials, the corner of my pillow, the top of my blankets, a piece of a shawl, the edge of my bed, and a copy of an evening paper, all of which things I would contrive, with the infinite patience of birds building their nests, to cement into one whole. Rooms where, in a keen frost, I would feel the satisfaction of being shut in from the outer world, like the sea swallow which builds at the end of a dark tunnel and is kept warm by the surrounding earth, and where, the fire keeping in all night, I would sleep wrapped up, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and savoury air, shot with the glow of the logs, which would break out again in flame, in a sort of alcove without walls, a cave of warmth dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat whose boundaries were constantly shifting and altering in temperature as gusts of air ran across them to strike freshly upon my face, from the corners of the room, or from parts near the window or far from the fireplace, which had therefore remained cold, or rooms in summer, where I would delight to feel myself a part of the warm evening, where the moonlight, striking upon the half-opened shutters, would throw down to the foot of my bed its enchanted ladder, where I would fall asleep, as it might be in the open air, like a titmouse which the breeze keeps poised in the focus of a sunbeam, or sometimes the Louis XVI room, so cheerful that I could never feel really unhappy, even on my first night in it. That room where the slender columns which lightly supported its ceiling would part, ever so gracefully, to indicate where the bed was and to keep it separate. Sometimes again, that little room with the high ceiling, hollowed in the form of a pyramid out of two separate stories and partly walled with mahogany, in which from the first moment my mind was drugged by the unfamiliar scent of flowering grasses, convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and of the insolent indifference of a clock that chattered on at the top of its voice as though I were not there, while a strange and pitiless mirror with square feet, which stood across one corner of the room, cleared for itself a sight I had not looked to find, tenanted in the quiet surroundings of my normal field of vision, that room in which my mind, forcing itself for hours on end to leave its moorings, to elongate itself upwards so as to take on the exact shape of the room, and to reach to the summit of that monstrous funnel, had passed so many anxious nights while my body lay stretched out in bed, my eyes staring upwards, my ears straining, my nostrils sniffing uneasily, and my heart beating, until custom had changed the color of the curtains, made the clock keep quiet, brought an expression of pity to the cruel slanting face of the glass, disguised or even completely dispelled the scent of flowering grasses, and distinctly reduced the apparent loftiness of the ceiling. Custom, that skillful but unhurrying manager who begins by torturing the mind for weeks on end with her provisional arrangements, whom the mind, for all that, is fortunate in discovering, for without the help of custom, it would never contrive, by its own efforts, to make any room seem habitable. Certainly I was now well awake. My body had turned about for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still, had set me down under my bedclothes, in my bedroom, and had fixed, approximately in their right places in the uncertain light, my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. But it was no good my knowing that I was not in any of those houses of which, in the stupid moment of waking, if I had not caught sight exactly, I could still believe in their possible presence. For memory was now set in motion. As a rule, I did not attempt to go to sleep again at once, but used to spend the greater part of the night recalling our life in the old days at Combre with my great-aunt, at Balbec, Paris, Doncières, Venice, and the rest, remembering again all the places and people that I had known, what I had actually seen of them, and what others had told me. At Combre, as every afternoon ended, long before the time when I should have to go up to bed, and to lie there, unsleeping, far from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom became the fixed point on which my melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered. Someone had had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern, which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come. In the manner of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, it substituted for the opaqueness of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomena of many colors, in which legends were depicted as on a shifting and transitory window. But my sorrows were only increased, because this change of lighting destroyed, as nothing else could have done, the customary impression I had formed of my room, thanks to which the room itself, but for the torture of having to go to bed in it, had become quite endurable. For now, I no longer recognized it, and I became uneasy as though I were in a room in some hotel or furnished lodging, in a place where I had just arrived by train for the first time. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, his mind filled with an infamous design, issued from the little three-cornered forest which dyed dark green the slope of a convenient hill, and advanced by leaps and bounds towards the castle of poor Geneviève de Brabant. This castle was cut off short by a curved line, which was in fact the circumference of one of the transparent ovals in the slides, which were pushed into position through a slot in the lantern. It was only the wing of a castle, and in front of it stretched a moor, on which Geneviève stood, lost in contemplation, wearing a blue girdle. The castle and the moor were yellow, but I could tell their colour without waiting to see them, for before the slides made their appearance, the old gold sonorous name of Brabant had given me an unmistakable clue. Golo stopped for a moment and listened sadly to the little speech read aloud by my great-aunt, which he seemed perfectly to understand, for he modified his attitude with a docility not devoid of a degree of majesty, so as to conform to the indications given in the text. Then he rode away at the same jerky trot. And nothing could arrest his slow progress. If the lantern were moved, I could still distinguish Golo's horse advancing across the window curtains, swelling out with their curves and diving into their folds. The body of Golo himself, being of the same supernatural substance as his steeds, overcame all material obstacles, everything that seemed to bar his way, by taking each as it might be a skeleton and embodying it in himself. The door-handle, for instance, over which, adapting itself at once, would float invincibly his red cloak or his pale face, never losing its nobility or its melancholy, never showing any sign of trouble at such a transubstantiation. And indeed, I found plenty of charm in these bright projections, which seemed to have come straight out of a Merovingian past, and to shed around me the reflections of such ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at such an intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality until I thought no more of the room than of myself. The anesthetic effect of custom being destroyed, I would begin to think and to feel very melancholy things. The door-handle of my room, which was different to me from all the other door-handles in the world, inasmuch as it seemed to open of its own accord, and without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its manipulation become. Lo and behold, it was now an astral body for Golo. And as soon as the dinner bell rang, I would run down to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, but well acquainted with my family and the dish of stewed beef, shed the same light as on every other evening, and I would fall into the arms of my mother, whom the misfortunes of Geneviève de Brabant had made all the dearer to me, just as the crimes of Golo had driven me to a more than ordinarily scrupulous examination of my own conscience. But after dinner, alas, I was soon obliged to leave Mamma, who stayed talking with the others, in the garden if it was fine, or in the little parlour where everyone took shelter when it was wet. Everyone except my grandmother, who held that it is a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and used to carry on endless discussions with my father on the very wettest days, because he would send me up to my room with a book instead of letting me stay out of doors. "That is not the way to make him strong and active," she would say sadly, "especially this little man who needs all the strength and character that he can get." My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he took an interest in meteorology, while my mother, keeping very quiet so as not to disturb him, looked at him with tender respect, but not too hard, not wishing to penetrate the mysteries of his superior mind. But my grandmother, in all weathers, even when the rain was coming down in torrents, and Françoise had rushed indoors with the precious wicker armchairs so that they should not get soaked, you would see my grandmother pacing the deserted garden, lashed by the storm, pushing back her grey hair in disorder so that her brows might be more free to imbibe the life-giving draughts of wind and rain. She would say, "At last one can breathe," and would run up and down the soaking paths, too straight and symmetrical for her liking, owing to the want of any feeling for nature in the new gardener whom my father had been asking all morning if the weather were going to improve, with her keen, jerky little step, regulated by the various effects wrought upon her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the force of hygiene, the stupidity of my education, and of symmetry in gardens, rather than by any anxiety, for that was quite unknown to her, to save her plum-colored skirt from the spots of mud, under which it would gradually disappear to a depth which always provided her maid with a fresh problem and filled her with fresh despair. When these walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, there was one thing which never failed to bring her back to the house. That was if, at one of those points, when the revolutions of her course brought her moth-like in sight of the lamp in the little parlour where the liqueurs were set out on the card table, my great-aunt called out to her, "Bathilda, come in and stop your husband from drinking brandy." For, simply to tease her, she had brought so foreign a type of mind into my father's family that everyone made a joke of it. My great-aunt used to make my grandfather, who was forbidden liqueurs, take just a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in and beg and implore her husband not to taste the brandy, and he would become annoyed and swallow his few drops all the same, and she would go out again sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble and so sweet that her gentleness towards others and her continual subordination of herself and of her own troubles appeared on her face blended in a smile, which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, had no trace in it of irony save for herself, while for all of us kisses seemed to spring from her eyes, which could not look upon those she loved without yearning to bestow upon them passionate caresses. The torments inflicted on her by my great-aunt, the sight of my grandmother's vain entreaties, of her in her weakness conquered before she began, but still making the futile endeavour to wean my grandfather from his liqueur glass, all these were things of the sort to which, in later years, one can grow so well accustomed as to smile at them, to take the tormentor's side with a happy determination which deludes one into the belief that it is not really tormenting. But in those days they filled me with such horror that I longed to strike my great-aunt. And yet, as soon as I heard her, "Bathilda, come in and stop your husband from drinking brandy," in my cowardice, I became at once a man, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. I ran up to the top of the house to cry by myself in a little room beside the schoolroom, and beneath the roof, which smelt of orris root, and was scented also by a wild currant bush, which had climbed up between the stones of the outer wall and thrust a flowering branch in through the half-opened window. Intended for a more special and a baser use, this room, from which in the daytime I could see as far as the keep of Roussainville-le-Pin, was for a long time my place of refuge, doubtless because it was the only room whose door I was allowed to lock, whenever my occupation was such as required an inviolable solitude, reading or dreaming, secret tears or paroxysms of desire. Alas, I little knew that my own lack of willpower, my delicate health, and the consequent uncertainty as to my future weighed far more heavily on my grandmother's mind than any little breach of the rules by her husband. During those endless perambulations, afternoon and evening, in which we used to see passing up and down, obliquely raised towards the heavens, her handsome face with its brown and wrinkled cheeks, which with age had acquired almost the purple hue of tilled fields in autumn, covered, if she were walking abroad, by a half-lifted veil, while upon them either the cold or some sad reflection invariably left the drying traces of an involuntary tear. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time. She went down again so soon that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw rustling along the double-doored corridor, was for me a moment of the keenest sorrow. So much did I love that good night that I reached the stage of hoping that it would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back, to say to her, kiss me just once again. But I knew that then she would at once look displeased, for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to me with this kiss of peace always annoyed my father, who thought such ceremonies absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the custom of having her there at all, which was a very different thing from letting the custom grow up of my asking her for an additional kiss when she was already crossing the threshold. And to see her look displeased destroyed all the sense of tranquillity she had brought me a moment before, when she bent her loving face down over my bed and held it out to me like a host for an act of communion in which my lips might drink deeply the sense of her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. But those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short a time in my room were sweet indeed, compared to those on which we had guests to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our guests were practically limited to Monsieur Swan, who, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Combre, sometimes to a neighbourly dinner, but less frequently since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes, after dinner, uninvited. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house beneath the big chestnut tree and round the iron table, we heard, from the far end of the garden, not the large and noisy rattle which heralded and deafened as he approached with its ferruginous, interminable frozen sound, any member of the household who had put it out of action by coming in without ringing, but the double peal, timid, oval, gilded, of the visitor's bell. Everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be M. Swan. My great-aunt, speaking in a loud voice to set an example, in a tone which she endeavoured to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so, that nothing could be more unpleasant for a stranger coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him which he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother would be sent out as a scout, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, which she would utilize to remove surreptitiously as she passed the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the barber had smoothed it down to make it stick out properly round his head. And there we would all stay, hanging on the words which would fall from my grandmother's lips when she brought us back her report of the enemy, as though there had been some uncertainty among a vast number of possible invaders, and then soon after my grandfather would say, "I can hear Swan's voice." And indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes, under a high forehead fringed with fair, almost red hair, dressed in the Bresson style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible, so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away, as though not going for anything in particular, to tell them to bring out the syrups, for my grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer, of their not being allowed to seem anything out of the ordinary, which we kept for visitors only. Although a far younger man, Monsieur Swan was very much attached to my grandfather, who had been an intimate friend, in his time, of Swan's father, an excellent but an eccentric man, in whom the least little thing would, it seemed, often check the flow of his spirits and divert the current of his thoughts. Several times in the course of a year I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story, which never varied, of the behaviour of Monsieur Swan, the elder, upon the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swans' family property on the outskirts of Combre, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the death chamber, so that he should not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly Monsieur Swan seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Oh, my dear old friend, How fortunate we are to be walking here together on such a charming day. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns and my new pond on which you have never congratulated me? You look as glum as a nightcap. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it's good to be alive all the same, my dear Amédée. And then, abruptly, the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness. He confined himself to a gesture which he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, dried his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And he could never be consoled for the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather during the 2 years for which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her very much at any one time. Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swan," became one of my grandfather's favorite phrases, which he would apply to all kinds of things. And I should have assumed that this father of Swans had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law and often led me in the long run to pardon offences which I should have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, albeit, and especially before his marriage, Monsieur Swan the younger came often to see them at Combre. My great-aunt and grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the kind of society which his family had frequented, or that, under the sort of incognito which the name of Swan gave him among us, they were harbouring, with the complete innocence of a family of honest innkeepers who have in their midst some distinguished highwayman and never know it. One of the smartest members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant part which Swan was playing in the world of fashion was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life which his parents already occupied, and nothing except the chance of a brilliant career or of a good marriage could extract you from that station or admit you to a superior caste. M. Swan, the father, had been a stockbroker, and so young Swan found himself immured for life in a caste where one's fortune, as in a list of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. We knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so we knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of the family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly that Swan himself, after he was left an orphan, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance, whom Swan knew, were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat, had he met them while he was walking with ourselves. Had there been such a thing as a determination to apply to Swan a social coefficient peculiar to himself, as distinct from all the other sons of other stockbrokers in his father's position, his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs because, leading a very simple life and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and piled up his collections in an old house which my grandmother longed to visit, but which stood on the Quai d'Orléans, a neighbourhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to be quartered. "Are you really a connoisseur now?" she would say to him. "I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers." For she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics and shewed, a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost impolitely silent and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the gallery in which the picture was hung or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule, he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us the story of his latest adventure, and he would have a fresh story for us on every occasion with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Combre chemist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never tell whether that was on account of the absurd parts which Swan invariably made himself play in the adventures, or of the wit that he shewed in telling us of them. It is easy to see that you are a regular character, Monsieur Swan. Now, as she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers, when Swan was mentioned, that he could easily, if he had wished to, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann or the Avenue de l'Opéra, and that he was the son of old Monsieur Swan, who must have left 4 or 5 million francs, but that it was a fad of his. A fad which, moreover, she thought, was bound to amuse other people so much that in Paris, when Monsieur Swan called on New Year's Day bringing her a little packet of Marin's glacis, she never failed, if there were strangers in the room, to say to him, "Well, Monsieur Swan, and do you still live next door to the bonded vaults, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyons?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye, over her glasses, at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my aunt that this Swan, who in his capacity as the son of old Monsieur Swan was fully qualified to be received by any of the upper middle class, the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go into abeyance, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some drawing-room on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes. That would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristeas, of knowing that he would, when he had finished his conversation with her, plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the plates we used for biscuits at Combre, as the thought of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who, as soon as he found himself alone and unobserved, would make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day, when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, and had begged pardon for being in evening clothes, Françoise, when he had gone, told us that she had got it from his coachman that he had been dining with a princess. "A pretty sort of princess," drawled my aunt. "I know them." And she shrugged her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely ironical. Altogether, my aunt used to treat him with scant ceremony. Since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations, she thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send to him whenever we wanted a recipe for some special sauce or for a pineapple salad for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, not seeming of sufficient importance to be served up to new friends, who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the House of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we? And don't want to, do we?" my great-aunt would say tartly to Swan, who had perhaps a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. she would make him play accompaniments and turn over music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang. Manipulating this creature, so rare and refined at other times and in other places, with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with some curio from the cabinet no more carefully than if it were a penny toy. Certainly the Swan, who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days, differed hugely from the Swan created in my great-aunt's mind when, of an evening, in our little garden at Combre, after the two shy peals had sounded from the gate, she would vitalize by injecting into it everything she had ever heard about the Swan family, the vague and unrecognizable shape which began to appear, with my grandmother in its wake, against a background of shadows, and could at last be identified by the sound of its voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole, which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is created by the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is, to some extent, an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the creature we see with all the ideas we have already formed about him, and in the complete picture of him which we compose in our minds, those ideas have certainly the principal place. In the end, they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose, they blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice, that these seem to be no more than a transparent envelope, so that each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is our own ideas of him which we recognize and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swan they had built up for their own purposes, my family had left out in their ignorance a whole crowd of the details of his daily life in the world of fashion, details by means of which other people, when they met him, saw all the graces enthroned in his face, and stopping at the line of his arched nose as at a natural frontier. But they contrived also to put into a face from which its distinction had been evicted, a face vacant and roomy as an untenanted house, to plant in the depths of its unvalued eyes a lingering sense, uncertain but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners, round the card table or in the garden, during our companionable country life. Our friend's bodily frame had been so well lined with this sense, and with various earlier memories of his family, that their own special Swan had become to my people a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person when, going back in memory, I pass from the Swan, whom I knew later and more intimately, to this early Swan. This early Swan, in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my childhood, and who, incidentally, is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a series of galleries in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, the same, so to speak, tonality, this early Swan abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, because of our caste theory, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests, the Marquise de Villeparisis of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I think you know Monsieur Swan very well. He is a great friend of my nephew's, the Delhomme." My grandmother had returned from the call full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens, and in which Madame de Villeparisis had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter, who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor a most distinguished man, the finest she had ever seen. For in her eyes, distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made, saying to Mamma, Sévigné would not have said it better, and, by way of contrast, of a nephew of Madame de Villeparisis, whom she had met at the house. My dear, he is so common. Now the effect of that remark about Swan had been not to raise him in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower Madame de Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to Madame de Villeparisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in her duty in becoming aware of Swan's existence and in allowing members of her family to associate with him. How should she know Swan, a lady who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon? This view of Swan's social atmosphere which prevailed in my family seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst class, you might almost say a fast woman, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to us alone, though he came more and more seldom, but from whom they thought they could establish, on the assumption that he had found her there, the circle, unknown to them, in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that Monsieur Swan was one of the most faithful attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the little details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Mole, the Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swan associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, however, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swan, for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, was condemned to utter degradation in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of those friendly relations with people of good position which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit, for my great-aunt had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer we had known because he had married a highness and had thereby stepped down, in her eyes, from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen, or stable boys mostly, to whom we read that queens have sometimes shown their favours. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swan, when next he came to dine with us, about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. On the other hand, my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty ambition, who for that reason were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be called the pinchbeck things of life, even when they had an historic value, or, generally speaking, in anything that was not directly associated with some object aesthetically precious. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly a part of our everyday life, that their sense of hearing, which had gradually come to understand its own futility when the tone of the conversation at the dinner table became frivolous or merely mundane, without the two old ladies being able to guide it back to the topic dear to themselves, would leave its receptive channels unemployed so effectively that they were actually becoming atrophied, so that if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he would have to make use of some such alarm signals as mad doctors adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, as by beating several times on a glass with the blade of a knife, fixing them at the same time with a sharp word and a compelling glance, violent methods which the said doctors are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from force of professional habit or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when, The day before Swan was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present of a case of Asti, my great-aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro, in which to the name of a picture then on view in a Corot exhibition were added the words "From the collection of Monsieur Charles Swan," asked, "Did you see that Swan is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I have always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had plenty of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For, knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. But we sat silent. My grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swan this reference to him in the Figaro, my great-aunt dissuaded them. Whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity, so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal allusion in a wealth of ingenious circumlocution that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of managing to induce my father to consent to speak to Swan, not of his wife, but of his daughter, whom he worshipped and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. You need only say a word, just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him. My father, however, was annoyed. "No, no, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous." But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swan's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself, and that was because, on the evenings when there were visitors, or just M. Swan in the house, Mamma did not come up to my room. I did not, at that time, have dinner with the family. I came out to the garden after dinner, and at 9 I said good night and went to bed. But on these evenings I used to dine earlier than the others, and to come in afterwards and sit at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss which Mamma used always to leave upon my lips when I was in bed and just going to sleep, I had to take with me from the dining-room to my own, and to keep inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And just on those very evenings when I must needs take most pains to receive it with due formality, I had to snatch it, to seize it instantly and in public, without even having the time or being properly free to apply to what I was doing the punctiliousness which madmen use, who compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds while they are shutting a door, so that when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again, they can triumphantly face and overcome it with the recollection of the precise moment in which the door was shut. We were all in the garden when the double peal of the gate bell sounded shyly. Everyone knew that it must be Swan, and yet they looked at one another inquiringly and sent my grandmother scouting. "See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine," my grandfather warned his two sisters-in-law. "You know how good it is, and it is a huge case." "Now don't start whispering," said my great-aunt. "How would you like to come into a house and find everyone muttering to themselves?" "Ah, there's Miss Swan," cried my father. "Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine tomorrow." My mother fancied that a word from her would wipe out all the unpleasantness which my family had contrived to make Swan feel since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment. But I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her go out of reach of me, while I felt that in a few minutes I should have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up, later, to kiss me. "Now, Monsieur Swan," she said, "do tell me about your daughter. I am sure she shews a taste already for nice things, like her papa." "Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda," said my grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon the quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as great poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. "We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves," she said, or rather whispered to Swan. "It is only a mother who can understand. I am sure that hers would agree with me." And so we all sat down round the iron table. I should have liked not to think of the hours of anguish which I should have to spend that evening alone in my room without the possibility of going to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, really, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future which would carry me, as on a bridge, across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look which I shot at my mother, would not allow any other impression to enter. Thoughts did indeed enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty or even of quaintness, by which I might have been distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, by means of a local anesthetic, can look on with a clear consciousness while an operation is being performed upon him and yet feel nothing, I could repeat to myself some favourite lines, or watch my grandfather attempting to talk to Swan about the Duc d'Audriffet-Pasquier without being able to kindle any emotion from one or amusement from the other. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swan about that orator when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence, which her natural politeness bade her interrupt, addressed the other with, "Just fancy, Flora, I met a young Swedish governess today who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," said her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time either. I met such a clever old gentleman at Monsieur Vinteuil's, who knows Maubant quite well, and Maubant has told him every little thing about how he gets up his parts. It is the most interesting thing I ever heard. He is a neighbour of Monsieur Vinteuil's, and I never knew. And he is so nice besides." "Monsieur Vinteuil is not the only one who has nice neighbours," cried my Aunt Céline, in a voice which seemed loud because she was so timid, and seemed forced because she had been planning the little speech for so long, darting, as she spoke, what she called a significant glance at Swan. And my Aunt Flora, who realized that this veiled utterance was Céline's way of thanking Swan intelligibly for the Asti, looked at him with a blend of congratulation and irony, either just because she wished to underline her sister's little epigram, or because she envied Swan his having inspired it, or merely because she imagined that he was embarrassed and could not help having a little fun at his expense. "I think it would be worthwhile," Flora went on, "to have this old gentleman to dinner. When you get him upon Maubant or Madame Materna, he will talk for hours on end." "That must be delightful," sighed my grandfather, in whose mind nature had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the cooperative movement among the ladies of Sweden, or in the methods employed by Maubant to get up his parts, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with a grain of that precious salt which one has oneself to add to taste in order to extract any savour from a narrative of the private life of Mole or of the Comte de Paris. "I say," exclaimed Swan to my grandfather, "what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you were asking me just now, for in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in St. Simon this morning which would have amused you. It is in the volume which covers his mission to Spain. Not one of the best, little more in fact than a journal, but at least it is a journal wonderfully well written, which fairly distinguishes it from the devastating journalism that we feel bound to read in these days, morning, noon, and night. I do not agree with you. There are some days when I find reading the papers very pleasant indeed. My Aunt Flora broke in to show Swan that she had read the note about his Corot in the Figaro. Yes, Aunt Celine went one better, when they write about things or people in whom we are interested. I don't deny it, answered Swan in some bewilderment. The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that, every morning, when we tore the wrapper off our paper with fevered hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it, oh, I don't know, shall we say Pascal's Pensées? He articulated the title with an ironic emphasis so as not to appear pedantic. And then, in the gilt and tooled volumes which we open once in 10 years, he went on, shewing that contempt for the things of this world which some men of the world like to affect, we should read that the Queen of the Hellenes had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princess de Léon had given a fancy dress ball. In that way, we should arrive at the right proportion between information and publicity. But at once regretting that he had allowed himself to speak, even in jest, of serious matters, he added ironically, "We are having a most entertaining conversation. I cannot think why we climb to these lofty summits." And then, turning to my grandfather, "Well, Saint-Simon tells how Maulevrier had had the audacity to offer his hand to his sons. You remember how he says of Maulevrier, 'Never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill-humour, boorishness, and folly.'" "Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there is something very different," said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swan as well as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Celine began to laugh. Swan was puzzled, but went on. "I cannot say whether it was his ignorance or a trap," writes St. Simon. "He wished to give his hand to my children. I noticed it in time to prevent him." My grandfather was already in ecstasies over ignorance or a trap, but Miss Celine, the name of St. Simon, a man of letters, having arrested the complete paralysis of her sense of hearing, had grown angry. "What? You admire that, do you? Well, it is clever enough. But what is the point of it? Does he mean that one man isn't as good as another? What difference can it make whether he is a duke or a groom, so long as he is intelligent and good? He had a fine way of bringing up his children, your St. Simon, if he didn't teach them to shake hands with all honest men. Really and truly, it's abominable. And you dare to quote it." And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be for him, against this opposition, to attempt to get Swan to tell him the stories which would have amused him, murmured to my mother, "Just tell me again, that line of yours which always comforts me so much on these occasions." "Oh, yes. 'What virtues, Lord, thou makest us abhor. Good, that is, very good.'" I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when they were at table, I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner-time, and that mamma, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to give her in public the series of kisses that she would have had in my room. And so I promised myself that in the dining-room, as they began to eat and drink, and as I felt the hour approach, I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and stealthy in execution, everything that my own efforts could put into it, would look out very carefully first the exact spot on her cheek where I would imprint it, and would so prepare my thoughts that I might be able, thanks to these mental preliminaries, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mamma would allow me to the sensation of her cheek against my lips, as a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only prepares his palette, and from what he remembers, and from rough notes, does in advance everything which he possibly can do in the sitter's absence. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "The little man looks tired. He'd better go up to bed. Besides, we are dining late tonight." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along, to bed with you." I would have kissed Mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone. You've said good night quite enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go on upstairs." And so I must set forth without viaticum, must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by her kiss, given my heart leave to accompany me forth. That hateful staircase, up which I always passed with such dismay, gave out a smell of varnish which had to some extent absorbed, made definite, and fixed the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even more cruel to my sensibility, because, when it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep with a maddening toothache, and are conscious of it only as a little girl whom we attempt, time after time, to pull out of the water, or as a line of Molière which we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up, so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the precise converse of this relief which I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my room invaded my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous almost, a manner at once insidious and brutal as I breathed in, a far more poisonous thing than any moral penetration, the peculiar smell of the varnish upon that staircase. Once in my room, I had to stop every loophole, to close the shutters, to dig my own grave as I turned down the bedclothes, to wrap myself in the shroud of my nightshirt. But before burying myself in the iron bed which had been placed there because, on summer nights, I was too hot among the red curtains of the four-poster, I was stirred to revolt and attempted the desperate stratagem of a condemned prisoner. I wrote to my mother, begging her to come upstairs for an important reason, which I could not put in writing. My fear was that Françoise, my aunt's cook, who used to be put in charge of me when I was at Combre, might refuse to take my note. I had a suspicion that, in her eyes, to carry a message to my mother when there was a stranger in the room would appear flatly inconceivable, just as it would be for the doorkeeper of a theatre to hand a letter to an actor upon the stage. For things which might or might not be done, she possessed a code at once imperious, abundant, subtle, and uncompromising on points themselves imperceptible or irrelevant, which gave it a resemblance to those ancient laws which combine such cruel ordinances as the massacre of infants at the breast with prohibitions of exaggerated refinement against seething the kid in his mother's milk, or eating of the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh. This code, if one could judge it by the sudden obstinacy which she would put into her refusal to carry out certain of our instructions, seemed to have foreseen such social complications and refinements of fashion as nothing in Françoise's surroundings or in her career as a servant in a village household could have put into her head, and we were obliged to assume that there was latent in her some past existence in the ancient history of France, noble and little understood, just as there is in those manufacturing towns where old mansions still testify to their former courtly days, and chemical workers toil among delicately sculptured scenes of the miracle of Theophilus or the Quatrephil's Ammon. In this particular instance, the article of her code which made it highly improbable that, barring an outbreak of fire, Françoise would go down and disturb Mamma, when Monsieur Swan was there, for so unimportant a person as myself was one embodying the respect she shewed, not only for the family, as for the dead, for the clergy, or for royalty, but also for the stranger within our gates. A respect which I should perhaps have found touching in a book, but which never failed to irritate me on her lips, because of the solemn and gentle tones in which she would utter it, and which irritated me more than usual this evening, when the sacred character in which she invested the dinner party might have the effect of making her decline to disturb its ceremonial. But to give myself one chance of success, I lied without hesitation, telling her that it was not in the least myself who had wanted to write to Mamma, but Mamma who, on saying good night to me, had begged me not to forget to send her an answer about something she had asked me to find, and that she would certainly be very angry if this note were not taken to her. I think that Françoise disbelieved me, for, like those primitive men whose senses were so much keener than our own, she could immediately detect, by signs imperceptible by the rest of us, the truth or falsehood of anything that we might wish to conceal from her. She studied the envelope for 5 minutes, as though an examination of the paper itself and the look of my handwriting could enlighten her as to the nature of the contents, or tell her to which article of her code she ought to refer the matter. Then she went out with an air of resignation, which seemed to imply, "What a dreadful thing for parents to have a child like this." A moment later, she returned to say that they were still at the ice stage, and that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the note at once, in front of everybody, but that when the finger bowls were put round, he would find a way of slipping it into Mamma's hand. At once my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer, as it had been a moment ago, until tomorrow that I had lost my mother, for my little line was going. To annoy her, no doubt, and doubly so because this contrivance would make me ridiculous in Swan's eyes, but was going all the same to admit me, invisibly and by stealth, into the same room as herself, was going to whisper from me into her ear, for that forbidden and unfriendly dining room where but a moment ago the ice itself, with burned nuts in it, and the finger bowls seemed to me to be concealing pleasures that were mischievous and of a mortal sadness, because Mamma was tasting of them, and I was far away, had opened its doors to me, and like a ripe fruit which burst through its skin, was going to pour out into my intoxicated heart the gushing sweetness of Mamma's attention while she was reading what I had written. Now I was no longer separated from her. The barriers were down. An exquisite thread was binding us. Besides, that was not all, for surely Mamma would come. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagined that Swan would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and had guessed its purpose. Whereas, on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years, and no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that moment so well as himself. To him, that anguish which lies in knowing that the creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not and cannot follow. To him that anguish came through love, to which it is in a sense predestined, by which it must be equipped and adapted. But when, as had befallen me, such an anguish possesses one's soul, before love has yet entered into one's life, then it must drift, awaiting love's coming, vague and free, without precise attachment, at the disposal of one sentiment today, of another tomorrow, of filial piety or affection for a comrade. And the joy with which I first bound myself apprentice, when Françoise returned to tell me that my letter would be delivered. Swan, too, had known well that false joy which a friend can give us, or some relative of the woman we love, when on his arrival at the house or theatre where she is to be found, for some ball or party or first night at which he is to meet her, he sees us wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity of communicating with her. He recognizes us, greets us familiarly, and asks what we are doing there. And when we invent a story of having some urgent message to give to his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be more simple, takes us in at the door, and promises to send her down to us in 5 minutes. How much we love him, as at that moment I loved Françoise, the good-natured intermediary who by a single word has made supportable, human, almost propitious, the inconceivable, infernal scene of gaiety in the thick of which we had been imagining swarms of enemies, perverse and seductive, beguiling away from us, even making laugh at us, the woman whom we love. If we are to judge of them by him, this relative who has accosted us and who is himself an initiate in those cruel mysteries, then the other guests cannot be so very demoniacal. Those inaccessible and torturing hours into which she had gone to taste of unknown pleasures. Behold, a breach in the wall, and we are through it. Behold, one of the moments whose series will go to make up their sum, a moment as genuine as the rest, if not actually more important to ourselves, because our mistress is more intensely a part of it. We picture it to ourselves, we possess it, we intervene upon it, almost we have created it, namely, the moment in which he goes to tell her that we are waiting there below. And very probably the other moments of the party will not be essentially different, will contain nothing else so exquisite or so well able to make us suffer, since this kind friend has assured us that, of course, she will be delighted to come down. It will be far more amusing for her to talk to you than to be bored up there. Alas, Swan had learned by experience that the good intentions of a third party are powerless to control a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued even into a ballroom by a man whom she does not love. Too often, the kind friend comes down again alone. My mother did not appear, but with no attempt to safeguard my self-respect, which depended upon her keeping up the fiction that she had asked me to let her know the result of my search for something or other, made Françoise tell me in so many words, "There is no answer," words I have so often since then heard the hall porters in mansions and the flunkies in gambling clubs and the like repeat to some poor girl who replies in bewilderment, "What? He said nothing? It's not possible. You did give him my letter, didn't you? Very well, I shall wait a little longer." And just as she invariably protests that she does not need the extra gas which the porter offers to light for her, and sits on there, hearing nothing further, except an occasional remark on the weather which the porter exchanges with a messenger whom he will send off suddenly, when he notices the time, to put some customer's wine on the ice. So having declined François' offer to make me some tea or to stay beside me, I let her go off again to the servants' hall and lay down and shut my eyes and tried not to hear the voices of my family who were drinking their coffee in the garden. But after a few seconds I realized that, by writing that line to Mamma, by approaching, at the risk of making her angry, so near to her that I felt I could reach out and grasp the moment in which I should see her again, I had cut myself off from the possibility of going to sleep until I actually had seen her, and my heart began to beat more and more painfully as I increased my agitation by ordering myself to keep calm and to acquiesce in my ill fortune. Then suddenly my anxiety subsided. A feeling of intense happiness coursed through me as when a strong medicine begins to take effect and one's pain vanishes. I had formed a resolution to abandon all attempts to go to sleep without seeing Mamma, and had decided to kiss her at all costs, even with the certainty of being in disgrace with her for long afterwards, when she herself came up to bed. The tranquillity which followed my anguish made me extremely alert, no less than my sense of expectation, my thirst for, and my fear of danger. Noiselessly, I opened the window and sat down on the foot of my bed, hardly daring to move in case they should hear me from below. Things outside seemed also fixed in mute expectation, so as not to disturb the moonlight, which, duplicating each of them and throwing it back by the extension forwards of a shadow denser and more concrete than its substance, had made the whole landscape seem at once thinner and longer, like a map which, after being folded up, is spread out upon the ground. What had to move, a leaf of the chestnut tree, for instance, moved, but its minute shuddering, complete, finished to the least detail, and with utmost delicacy of gesture, made no discord with the rest of the scene, and yet was not merged in it, remaining clearly outlined. Exposed upon this surface of silence, which absorbed nothing from them, the most distant sounds, those which must have come from gardens at the far end of the town, could be distinguished with such exact finish that the impression they gave of coming from a distance seemed due only to their pianissimo execution, like those movements on muted strings so well performed by the orchestra of the conservatoire, that although one does not lose a single note, one thinks all the same that they are being played somewhere outside, a long way from the concert hall, so that all the old subscribers and my grandmother's sisters, too, when Swan had given them his seats, used to strain their ears as if they had caught the distant approach of an army on the march, which had not yet rounded the corner of the Rue de Trévise. I was well aware that I had placed myself in a position than which none could be counted upon to involve me in graver consequences at my parents' hands, consequences far graver, indeed, than a stranger would have imagined, and such as, he would have thought, could follow only some really shameful fault. But in the system of education which they had given me, faults were not classified in the same order as in that of other children, and I had been taught to place at the head of the list, doubtless because there was no other class of faults from which I needed to be more carefully protected, those in which I can now distinguish the common feature, that one succumbs to them by yielding to a nervous impulse. But such words as these last had never been uttered in my hearing. No one had yet accounted for my temptations in a way which might have led me to believe that there was some excuse for my giving in to them, or that I was actually incapable of holding out against them. Yet I could easily recognize this class of transgressions by the anguish of mind which preceded, as well as by the rigor of the punishment which followed them. And I knew that what I had just done was in the same category as certain other sins for which I had been severely chastised, though infinitely more serious than they. When I went out to meet my mother, as she herself came up to bed, and when she saw that I had remained up so as to say good night to her again in the passage, I should not be allowed to stay in the house a day longer. I should be packed off to school next morning. So much was certain. Very good. Had I been obliged, the next moment, to hurl myself out of the window, I should still have preferred such a fate. For what I wanted now was Mamma, and to say good night to her. I had gone too far along the road which led to the realization of this desire to be able to retrace my steps. I could hear my parents' footsteps as they went with Swan, and when the rattle of the gate assured me that he had really gone, I crept to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he had thought the lobster good, and whether Monsieur Swan had had some of the coffee and pistachio ice. I thought it rather so-so, she was saying. Next time we shall have to try another flavor. I can't tell you, said my great-aunt, what a change I find in Swan. He is quite antiquated. She had grown so accustomed to seeing Swan always in the same stage of adolescence that it was a shock to her to find him suddenly less young than the age she still attributed to him. And the others, too, were beginning to remark in Swan that abnormal, excessive, scandalous senescence meet only in a celibate, in one of that class for whom it seems that the great day which knows no morrow must be longer than for other men, since for such a one it is void of promise, and from its dawn the moments steadily accumulate without any subsequent partition among his offspring. I fancy he has a lot of trouble with that wretched wife of his, who lives with a certain Monsieur de Charlus, as all Combre knows. It's the talk of the town. My mother observed that, in spite of this, He had looked much less unhappy of late, and he doesn't nearly so often do that trick of his, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and passing his hand across his forehead. I think myself that in his heart of hearts he doesn't love his wife any more. Why, of course he doesn't, answered my grandfather. He wrote me a letter about it ages ago to which I took care to pay no attention, but it left no doubt as to his feelings, let alone his love for his wife. Hello, you two. You never thanked him for the asti, he went on, turning to his sisters-in-law. What, we never thanked him? I think, between you and me, that I put it to him quite neatly, replied my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it very well. I admired you for it, said my Aunt Celine. But you did it very prettily, too. Yes, I liked my expression about nice neighbors. What? Do you call that thanking him? Shouted my grandfather. I heard that all right, but devil take me if I guessed it was meant for Swan. You may be quite sure he never noticed it. Come, come, Swan is not a fool. I am positive he appreciated the compliment. You didn't expect me to tell him the number of bottles or to guess what he paid for them. My father and mother were left alone and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, Well, shall we go up to bed? As you wish, dear, though I don't feel in the least like sleeping. I don't know why. It can't be the coffee ice. It wasn't strong enough to keep me awake like this. But I see a light in the servants' hall. Poor Françoise has been sitting up for me, so I will get her to unhook me while you go and undress. My mother opened the lattice door, which led from the hall to the staircase. Presently I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. I went quietly into the passage. My heart was beating so violently that I could hardly move, but at least it was throbbing no longer with anxiety, but with terror and with joy. I saw in the well of the stair a light coming upwards from Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself. I threw myself upon her. For an instant she looked at me in astonishment, not realizing what could have happened. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. She said not a single word to me, and for that matter I used to go for days on end without being spoken to, for far less offences than this. A single word from Mamma would have been an admission that further intercourse with me was within the bounds of possibility, and that might perhaps have appeared to me more terrible still, as indicating that, with such a punishment as was in store for me, mere silence and even anger were relatively puerile. A word from her, then, would have implied the false calm, in which one converses with a servant to whom one has just decided to give notice. The kiss one bestows on a son who is being packed off to enlist, which would have been denied him if it had merely been a matter of being angry with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming from the dressing-room, where he had gone to take off his clothes, and to avoid the scene which he would make if he saw me, she said, in a voice half stifled by her anger, "Run away at once. Don't let your father see you standing there like a crazy Jane." But I begged her again to come and say good night to me, terrified as I saw the light from my father's candle already creeping up the wall, but also making use of his approach as a means of blackmail, in the hope that my mother, not wishing him to find me there, as find me he must if she continued to hold out, would give in to me and say, "Go back to your room, I will come." Too late. My father was upon us. Instinctively I murmured, though no one heard me, "I am done for." I was not, however. My father used constantly to refuse to let me do things which were quite clearly allowed by the more liberal charters granted me by my mother and grandmother, because he paid no heed to principles, and because in his sight there were no such things as rights of man. For some quite irrelevant reason, or for no reason at all, he would at the last moment prevent me from taking some particular walk, one so regular and so consecrated to my use that to deprive me of it was a clear breach of faith. Or again, as he had done this evening, long before the appointed hour, he would snap out, "Run along up to bed now, no excuses." But then again, simply because he was devoid of principles, in my grandmother's sense, so he could not, properly speaking, be called inexorable. He looked at me for a moment with an air of annoyance and surprise, and then when Mamma had told him, not without some embarrassment, what had happened, said to her, "Go along with him then. You said just now that you didn't feel like sleep, so stay in his room for a little. I don't need anything." "But dear," my mother answered timidly, "whether or not I feel like sleep is not the point. We must not make the child accustomed." "There's no question of making him accustomed," said my father, with a shrug of the shoulders. "You can see quite well that the child is unhappy. After all, we aren't jailers. You'll end by making him ill, and a lot of good that will do. There are 2 beds in his room. Tell Françoise to make up the big one for you, and stay beside him for the rest of the night. I'm off to bed anyhow. I'm not nervous like you. Good night." It was impossible for me to thank my father. What he called my sentimentality would have exasperated him. I stood there not daring to move. He was still confronting us, an immense figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with the pink and violet scarf of Indian cashmere in which, since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia, he used to tie up his head, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benozzo Gozzoli which Miss Swan had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. Many years have passed since that night. The wall of the staircase, up which I had watched the light of his candle gradually climb, was long ago demolished. And in myself, too, many things have perished which, I imagined, would last forever. And new structures have arisen, giving birth to new sorrows and new joys, which in those days I could not have foreseen, just as now the old are difficult of comprehension. It is a long time, too, since my father has been able to tell Mamma to go with the child. Never again will such hours be possible for me, but of late I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs which I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and which broke out only when I found myself alone with Mamma. Actually, their echo has never ceased. It is only because life is now growing more and more quiet round about me that I hear them afresh, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the streets that one would suppose them to have been stopped forever, until they sound out again through the silent evening air. Mamma spent that night in my room, when I had just committed a sin so deadly that I was waiting to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I should ever have won as the reward of a good action. Even at the moment when it manifested itself in this crowning mercy, my father's conduct towards me was still somewhat arbitrary, and regardless of my deserts, as was characteristic of him, and due to the fact that his actions were generally dictated by chance expediencies rather than based on any formal plan. And perhaps even what I called his strictness, when he sent me off to bed, deserved that title less, really, than my mother's or grandmother's attitude, for his nature, which in some respects differed more than theirs from my own, had probably prevented him from guessing, until then, how wretched I was every evening, a thing which my mother and grandmother knew well. But they loved me enough to be unwilling to spare me that suffering, which they hoped to teach me to overcome, so as to reduce my nervous sensibility and to strengthen my will. As for my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, I doubt if he would have shown so much courage, for as soon as he had grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he had said to my mother, "Go and comfort him." Mamma stayed all night in my room, and it seemed that she did not wish to mar by recrimination those hours, so different from anything that I had had a right to expect. For when Françoise, who guessed that something extraordinary must have happened when she saw Mamma sitting by my side, holding my hand and letting me cry unchecked, said to her, "But, madam, what is little master crying for?" She replied, "Why, Françoise, he doesn't know himself. It is his nerves. Make up the big bed for me quickly, and then go off to your own." And thus, for the first time, my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a fault for which I must be punished, but as an involuntary evil which had been officially recognized, a nervous condition for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation that I need no longer mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforward without sin. I felt no small degree of pride, either, in Françoise's presence at this return to humane conditions, which, not an hour after Mamma had refused to come up to my room, and had sent the snubbing message that I was to go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up person, brought me of a sudden to a sort of puberty of sorrow, to emancipation from tears. I ought then to have been happy. I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession which must have been painful to her, that it was a first step down from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she, with all her courage, had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just scored a victory, it was over her, that I had succeeded, as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded in relaxing her will, in altering her judgment. That this evening opened a new era must remain a black date in the calendar. And if I had dared now, I should have said to Mamma, "No, I don't want you. You mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom of what would be called nowadays, the realism with which she tempered the ardent idealism of my grandmother's nature. And I knew that now the mischief was done, she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company and not to disturb my father again. Certainly my mother's beautiful features seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she sat gently holding my hands and trying to check my tears. But just for that reason, it seemed to me that this should not have happened. Her anger would have been less difficult to endure than this new kindness which my childhood had not known. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle upon her soul and made the first white hair shew upon her head. This thought redoubled my sobs, and then I saw that Mamma, who had never allowed herself to go to any length of tenderness with me, was suddenly overcome by my tears and had to struggle to keep back her own. Then, as she saw that I had noticed this, she said to me with a smile, "Why, my little buttercup, my little canary boy, he's going to make Mamma as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you can't sleep, and Mamma can't either, we mustn't go on in this stupid way. We must do something. I'll get one of your books." But I had none there. "Would you like me to get out the books now that your grandmother is going to give you for your birthday? Just think it over first, and don't be disappointed if there is nothing new for you then." I was only too delighted, and Mamma went to find a parcel of books, in which I could not distinguish, through the paper in which it was wrapped, any more than its squareness and size, but which, even at this first glimpse, brief and obscure as it was, bade fair to eclipse already the paint-box of last New Year's Day and the silkworms of the year before. It contained La Mare au Diable, François le Champy, La Petite Fadette, and Les Maîtres Sonneurs. My grandmother, as I learned afterwards, had at first chosen Marcel's poems, a volume of Rousseau and Indiana, for while she considered light reading as unwholesome as sweets and cakes, she did not reflect that the strong breath of genius must have upon the very soul of a child an influence at once more dangerous and less quickening than those of fresh air and country breezes upon his body. But when my father had seemed almost to regard her as insane on learning the names of the books she proposed to give me, she had journeyed back by herself to Jouy-le-Vicomte, to the booksellers, so that there should be no fear of my not having my present in time. It was a burning hot day, and she had come home so unwell that the doctor had warned my mother not to allow her again to tire herself in that way, and had there fallen back upon the 4 pastoral novels of George Sand. "My dear," she had said to Mamma, "I could not allow myself to give the child anything that was not well written." The truth was that she could never make up her mind to purchase anything from which no intellectual profit was to be derived, and, above all, that profit which good things bestowed on us by teaching us to seek our pleasures elsewhere than in the barren satisfaction of worldly wealth. Even when she had to make someone a present of the kind called useful, when she had to give an armchair or some table silver or a walking stick, she would choose antiques, as though their long desuetude had effaced from them any semblance of utility and fitted them rather to instruct us in the lives of the men of other days than to serve the common requirements of our own. She would have liked me to have in my room photographs of ancient buildings or of beautiful places, but at the moment of buying them, and for all that the subject of the picture had an aesthetic value of its own, she would find that vulgarity and utility had too prominent a part in them through the mechanical nature of their reproduction by photography. She attempted by a subterfuge, if not to eliminate altogether their commercial banality, at least to minimize it, to substitute for the bulk of it what was art still, to introduce, as it might be, several thicknesses of art. Instead of photographs of Chartres Cathedral, of the fountains of St. Cloud, or of Vesuvius, she would inquire of Swan whether some great painter had not made pictures of them, and preferred to give me photographs of Chartres Cathedral after Corot, of the fountains of St. Cloud after Hubert Robert, and of Vesuvius after Turner, which were a stage higher in the scale of art. But although the photographer had been prevented from reproducing directly the masterpieces or the beauties of nature, and had there been replaced by a great artist, he resumed his odious position when it came to reproducing the artist's interpretation. Accordingly, having to reckon again with vulgarity, my grandmother would endeavor to postpone the moment of contact still further. She would ask Swan if the picture had not been engraved, preferring, when possible, old engravings with some interest of association apart from themselves, such, for example, as shew us a masterpiece, in a state in which we can no longer see it today, as Morgan's print of the Cenacolo of Leonardo, before it was spoiled by restoration. It must be admitted that the results of this method of interpreting the art of making presents were not always happy. The idea which I formed of Venice from a drawing by Titian, which is supposed to have the lagoon in the background, was certainly far less accurate than what I have since derived from ordinary photographs. We could no longer keep count in the family when my great-aunt tried to frame an indictment of my grandmother. Of all the armchairs she had presented to married couples, young and old, which on a first attempt to sit down upon them had at once collapsed beneath the weight of their recipient. But my grandmother would have thought it sordid to concern herself too closely with the solidity of any piece of the furniture in which could still be discerned a flourish, a smile, a brave conceit of the past. And even what in such pieces supplied a material need, since it did so in a manner to which we are no longer accustomed, was as charming to her as one of those old forms of speech in which we can still see traces of a metaphor whose fine point has been worn away by the rough usage of our modern tongue. In precisely the same way, the pastoral novels of George Sand, which she was giving me for my birthday, were regular lumber rooms of antique furniture, full of expressions that have fallen out of use and returned as imagery, such as one finds now only in country dialects. And my grandmother had bought them in preference to other books, just as she would have preferred to take a house that had a Gothic dovecot, or some other such piece of antiquity as would have a pleasant effect on the mind, filling it with a nostalgic longing for impossible journeys through the realms of time. Mamma sat down by my bed. She had chosen François Le Champy, whose reddish cover and incomprehensible title gave it a distinct personality in my eyes and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. That prepared me in advance to imagine that François Le Champy contained something inexpressibly delicious. The course of the narrative, where it tended to arouse curiosity or melt to pity, certain modes of expression which disturb or sadden the reader, and which, with a little experience, he may recognize as common form in novels, seemed to me then distinctive, for to me a new book was not one of a number of similar objects, but was like an individual man, unmatched and with no cause of existence beyond himself, an intoxicating whiff of the peculiar essence of François Le Champy. Beneath the everyday incidents, the commonplace thoughts and hackneyed words, I could hear or overhear an intonation, a rhythmic utterance fine and strange. The action began. To me it seemed all the more obscure, because in those days when I read to myself, I used often, while I turned the pages, to dream of something quite different. And to the gaps which this habit made in my knowledge of the story more were added by the fact that when it was Mamma who was reading to me aloud, she left all the love scenes out. And so all the odd changes which take place in the relations between the miller's wife and the boy, changes which only the birth and growth of love can explain, seemed to me plunged and steeped in a mystery, the key to which, as I could readily believe, lay in that strange and pleasant-sounding name of Champy, which draped the boy who bore it, I knew not why, in its own bright colour, purpurate and charming. If my mother was not a faithful reader, she was none the less admirable when reading a work in which she found the note of true feeling by the respectful simplicity of her interpretation and by the sound of her sweet and gentle voice. It was the same in her daily life, when it was not works of art, but men and women whom she was moved to pity or admire. It was touching to observe with what deference she would banish from her voice, her gestures, from her whole conversation, now the note of joy which might have distressed some mother who had long ago lost a child. Now the recollection of an event or anniversary which might have reminded some old gentleman of the burden of his years, now the household topic which might have bored some young man of letters. And so, when she read aloud the prose of George Sand, prose which is everywhere redolent of that generosity and moral distinction which Mamma had learned from my grandmother to place above all other qualities in life, and which I was not to teach her until much later to refrain from placing, in the same way, above all other qualities in literature. Taking pains to banish from her voice any weakness or affectation which might have blocked its channel for that powerful stream of language, she supplied all the natural tenderness, all the lavish sweetness which they demanded to phrases which seemed to have been composed for her voice, and which were all, so to speak, within her compass. She came to them with the tone that they required, with the cordial accent which existed before they were, which dictated them, but which is not to be found in the words themselves. And by these means she smoothed away, as she read on, any harshness there might be, or discordance in the tenses of verbs, endowing the imperfect and the preterite with all the sweetness which there is in generosity, all the melancholy which there is in love, guided the sentence that was drawing to an end towards that which was waiting to begin, now hastening, now slackening the pace of the syllables so as to bring them, despite their difference of quantity, into a uniform rhythm, and breathed into this quite ordinary prose a kind of life, continuous and full of feeling. My agony was soothed. I let myself be borne upon the current of this gentle night, on which I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything but a rare and casual exception. Tomorrow night I should again be the victim of anguish, and Mamma would not stay by my side. But when these storms of anguish grew calm, I could no longer realize their existence. Besides, tomorrow evening was still a long way off. I reminded myself that I should still have time to think about things, albeit that remission of time could bring me no access of power, albeit the coming event was in no way dependent upon the exercise of my will, and seemed not quite inevitable only because it was still separated from me by this short interval. Elevation of an irregular pyramid, and, at the summit, my bedroom with the little passage through whose glazed door mamma would enter. In a word, seen always at the same evening hour, isolated from all its possible surroundings, detached and solitary against its shadowy background, the bare minimum of scenery necessary, like the setting one sees printed at the head of an old play, for its performance in the provinces, to the drama of my undressing, as though all Combre had consisted of but 2 floors joined by a slender staircase, and as though there had been no time there but 7 o'clock at night. I must own that I could have assured any questioner that Combre did include other scenes, and did exist at other hours than these. But since the facts which I should then have recalled would have been prompted only by an exercise of the will, by my intellectual memory, and since the pictures which that kind of memory shews us of the past preserve nothing of the past itself, I should never have had any wish to ponder over this residue of Combre. To me, it was in reality all dead. Permanently dead? Very possibly. There is a large element of hazard in these matters, and a second hazard, that of our own death, often prevents us from awaiting for any length of time the favours of the first. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree, or to obtain possession of the object which forms their prison. Then they start and tremble, they call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. We have delivered them, they have overcome death, and returned to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not before we ourselves must die. Many years had elapsed during which nothing of Combre, save what was comprised in the theatre and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me, when one day in winter as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, for no particular reason, changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called petite madeleine, which look as though they had been moulded in the fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And soon, mechanically, weary after a dull day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea, in which I had soaked a morsel of the cake. No sooner had the warm liquid and the crumbs with it touched my palate than a shudder ran through my whole body, and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary changes that were taking place. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory, this new sensation having had on me the effect which love has of filling me with a precious essence. Or rather, this essence was not in me, it was myself. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I was conscious that it was connected with the taste of tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savours, could not indeed be of the same nature as theirs. Whence did it come? What did it signify? How could I seize upon and define it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It is time to stop. The potion is losing its magic. It is plain that the object of my quest, the truth, lies not in the cup, but in myself. The tea has called up in me, but does not itself understand, and can only repeat indefinitely, with a gradual loss of strength, the same testimony, which I too cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call upon the tea for it again, and to find it there presently, intact and at my disposal for my final enlightenment. I put down my cup and examine my own mind. It is for it to discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind feels that some part of it has strayed beyond its own borders, when it, the seeker, is at once the dark region through which it must go seeking, where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek? More than that, create. It is face to face with something which does not so far exist, to which it alone can give reality and substance, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And I begin again to ask myself what it could have been, this unremembered state which brought with it no logical proof of its existence, but only the sense that it was a happy, that it was a real state in whose presence other states of consciousness melted and vanished. I decide to attempt to make it reappear. I retrace my thoughts to the moment at which I drank the first spoonful of tea. I find again the same state, illumined by no fresh light. I compel my mind to make one further effort to follow and recapture once again the fleeting sensation, and that nothing may interrupt it. In its course, I shut out every obstacle, every extraneous idea. I stop my ears and inhibit all attention to the sounds which come from the next room. And then, feeling that my mind is growing fatigued without having any success to report, I compel it for a change to enjoy that distraction which I have just denied it, to think of other things, to rest and refresh itself before the supreme attempt. And then for the second time I clear an empty space in front of it. I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I do not know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can measure the resistance, I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. Undoubtedly, what is thus palpitating in the depths of my being must be the image, the visual memory which, being linked to that taste, has tried to follow it into my conscious mind. But its struggles are too far off, too much confused. Scarcely can I perceive the colourless reflection in which are blended the uncapturable whirling medley of radiant hues, and I cannot distinguish its form, cannot invite it, as the one possible interpreter, to translate to me the evidence of its contemporary, its inseparable paramour, the taste of cake soaked in tea. Cannot ask it to inform me what special circumstance is in question, of what period in my past life. Will it ultimately reach the clear surface of my consciousness, this memory, this old dead moment, which the magnetism of an identical moment has travelled so far to importune, to disturb, to raise up out of the very depths of my being? I cannot tell. Now that I feel nothing, it has stopped, has perhaps gone down again into its darkness, from which who can say whether it will ever rise? 10 times over I must essay the task, must lean down over the abyss. And each time the natural laziness which deters us from every difficult enterprise, every work of importance, has urged me to leave the thing alone, to drink my tea, and to think merely of the worries of today and of my hopes for tomorrow, which let themselves be pondered over without effort or distress of mind. And suddenly the memory returns. The taste was that of the little crumb of madeleine, which on Sunday mornings at Combre, because on those mornings I did not go out before church time, when I went to say good day to her in her bedroom, my Aunt Leonie used to give me dipping it first in her own cup of real or of lime-flower tea. The sight of the little madeleine had recalled nothing to my mind before I tasted it, perhaps because I had so often seen such things in the interval without tasting them on the trays in pastry cooks' windows, that their image had dissociated itself from those Combre days to take its place among others more recent. Perhaps because of those memories, so long abandoned and put out of mind, nothing now survived. Everything was scattered. The forms of things, including that of the little scallop shell of pastry, so richly sensual under its severe religious folds, were either obliterated or had been so long dormant as to have lost the power of expansion which would have allowed them to resume their place in my consciousness. But when from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, still, alone, more fragile, but with more vitality, more unsubstantial, more persistent, more faithful, the smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment amid the ruins of all the rest, and bear unfaltering in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence the vast structure of recollection. And once I had recognized the taste of the crumb of madeleine soaked in her decoction of lime flowers which my aunt used to give me, although I did not yet know and must long postpone the discovery of why this memory made me so happy. Immediately the old grey house upon the street where her room was rose up like the scenery of a theatre to attach itself to the little pavilion, opening onto the garden which had been built out behind it for my parents, the isolated panel which until that moment had been all that I could see. And with the house, the town, from morning to night, and in all weathers, the square where I was sent before luncheon, the streets along which I used to run errands, the country roads we took when it was fine, and just as the Japanese amused themselves by filling a porcelain bowl with water and steeping in it little crumbs of paper which until then are without character or form, but the moment they become wet, stretch themselves and bend, take on color and distinctive shape, become flowers or houses or people, permanent and recognizable, so in that moment all the flowers in our garden and in Monsieur Swan's park, and the water lilies on the Vivonne, and the good folk of the village, and their little dwellings, and the parish church, and the whole of Combre and of its surroundings, taking their proper shapes and growing solid, sprang into being, town and gardens alike, from my cup of tea.